Hey guys, it's Hink here. So I came across a phenomenal post on my subreddit r/Hink, join if you haven't already, that really made me think, and I thought it was such a good post that I actually thought it warranted a video response actually from me. Here's the post here, and in it this guy talks about how he thinks that high pressure and everyday pumping is essentially overdone and it presents with significant risks. And so what I wanted to do is break down his post and point out kind of what I agree with, what I disagree with, and ultimately present some data, and hopefully you guys can make your conclusion on what you think is most safe and effective when it comes to pumping. So to start, he says, people get obsessed with pumping numbers, but the data from clinical vacuum therapy is very clear. The most effective and safest range for long-term tissue remodeling is around 5 to 6 inches of mercury. Here's where we start with the problem, and I'm not trying to be a prick here, but like being accurate matters. It says 5 to 6 inches of mercury, which is 170 to 200 millimeters of mercury. That's not actually correct. 5 to 6 inches of mercury is 127 to 152 millimeters of mercury. And so which one is it? Because if we're talking about 200 millimeters of mercury, that's actually closer to about 8 inches of mercury, or like 7.9 if you're rounding, okay? But there's a big difference within that pressure range. And I'm glad I wasn't the only one that noticed that, because here in the comments, we have a guy who says, I think your conversion is wrong. And that sways the entire argument of what he's trying to say. Now, this is just my fragile ego speaking, but I also feel like it was a bit of a barb at me when he's like, the data is very clear. What is exactly does he say? Yeah, the data is very clear. And, already like he comes out the gate and kind of fumbles the numbers. So, but once again, I'm not trying to be a prick. I'm definitely not trying to tear this guy down. It just kind of, I don't know, rubbed me the wrong way to get off started that way. But guys, so here's where I'm going to hit you with some data, okay? So here's a paper here that shows that you have to at least have 150 millimeters of mercury, which is just basically 6 inches of mercury to get any sort of clinical benefit. Now, this is an actual penile rehabilitation. So we're just talking about making sure there's adequate blood flow to the penis. The minimum is about 6 inches of mercury, where he says that the safest and most effective for tissue remodeling is 5 to 6 inches of mercury. So there's conflicting data. And here's another paper here showing that you don't even really get vasodilation until you hit at least 150 millimeters of mercury. So it's saying that like you don't even get basically blood going in there until you hit that number. How can that be the ideal range for tissue remodeling or for enlargement purposes when that's barely what you need even for the most minimal penile rehabilitation after prostate surgery? And so here's another quote from a paper showing that, now this was in the arteries of the arm, but it shows that you have to get to a subatmospheric pressure of at least 150 to 200 millimeters of mercury in order to get any kind of vasodilation benefit. And so that is actually arguing for higher than what he proposed in his initial 5 to 6 inches of mercury. Because once again, guys, 200 millimeters of mercury is about 7.9 inches of mercury. Moving forward, he starts talking about what's going to be the most effective and safest for long-term tissue remodeling. Like, where are you getting this number from, my friend? Because in this animal study here, it actually showed that the ideal range for actual penile rehabilitation purposes, once again, is 200 millimeters of mercury, which according to your range of 5 to 6 inches of mercury is significantly above that. And if you did truly mean 170 to 200 millimeters of mercury, then we're already at the tail end of even that range. And so next he says, medical grade studies on vacuum erection devices like those published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine show that above 200 millimeters of mercury, blood flow in the corpus cavernosum drops sharply. Find me that paper that shows that, because that is not at all what I've seen. All of these papers that talk about vacuum erection device use show that basically using the negative pressure actually increases oxygenation to the tissue overall. Now, when you're talking about actual like blood flow stasis or like the lack of blood flow movement, if you apply a negative pressure that's going to be great enough to basically draw blood into the penis, it's obviously going to keep it in there. You don't need that high of a pressure in order to achieve that. In my humble opinion, for what it's worth, I just don't think that's a valid argument. Now, what they have showed in these papers is that if you keep a C-ring in place for more than 30 minutes, that is when you actually start to see the markers of ischemia. There's also rat data that has showed that when you have set times that are above 10 minutes, that's when you start to see the markers of that can promote fibrosis like HIF and like TNF alpha. But that's also why I recommend sets times that are typically around 5 minutes or less. Then he goes on to say what actually drives growth is sustained time under tension. I agree with that to some extent, especially when we're talking about extender data. I think the data with length work using an extender is pretty clear that basically the more you do, the more you gain within reason. But actually, the only evidence I can find of published that actually is contrary to that in pumping is that actually more is more. Okay, you guys have heard me talk about this animal study once again, rat data. But I mean, like, look at this paragraph here. For pubertal rats, 200 millimeters of mercury lengthened the penis by 14%, while 300 millimeters of mercury increased it by 19.8%, suggesting that a higher mechanical force resulted in longer lengthening. I mean, you could argue that, hey, Hink, it's rat data. I don't think it's fair. But like, you also don't have evidence elsewise, especially when we're talking about pumping, that it's really like the total amount of time. Like, where is the data for that? Like, where is that coming from, man? But to his point here, it talks about how higher pressures like 400 or even 500 millimeters of mercury actually increase the side effects dramatically. However, the difference between 200 and 300 millimeters of mercury isn't that significant. 300 millimeters of mercury is about 11.8 inches of mercury, which according to this one study says that this is the ideal pressure for length while maximizing your length gains while slightly increasing but still minimizing the risk of side effects. In this same paper, there's actually evidence contrary to what he argues that too much pressure isn't safe, okay? Because in this study where they looked at the different pressures which created the most length, they also tested for erectile function. And would you believe that actually there was no difference in actually erectile function between the different groups when it comes to even the higher pressures? All of the erectile function was actually improved compared to the control. So next he says, a proven structure is 3 sets at 5 minutes with 1 to 2 minute break, 3 to 4 days a week, always with 5 to 10 minute warm up, moist heat, and a light massage afterwards. That gives you enough stimulus for fibroblast remodeling while letting the capillaries and nerves recover. That's not a bad routine. I'm going to talk about that a little bit further, but how is this proven? That's my only problem with this sentence is like a proven structure. Proven how? Are we talking about there's somebody that has some results on like getting bigger that shows that they actually gained using this routine? I mean, there's no clinical evidence that I can come across of anybody using a routine, I won't say even remotely like this, but certainly not that routine. I'm not trying to be a douche, but like I actually have my Hink trial where guys use my methods that I am talking about here and actually have 7 guys grew on average 1/2 inch in length and 1/4 inch in girth with pictures, not behind a paywall, that you can see right now. The link is in the description, guys, if you want to check that out. Also, the P long study, okay, that used 5 to 10 inches of mercury twice a day. Once again, I would argue that has proven results. You guys have heard me talk about like my problems with the P long trial before, but still the fact of the matter is there's actually published clinical evidence that you can point to saying that actually using a range of 5 to 10 inches of mercury twice a day, this has actually proven results. And when it comes to actual, like even extender studies, the extender studies, guys, if you haven't seen my extender playlist, check it out. But those guys were using an extender 6 to 8 hours a day, in some cases, 7 days a week. And so once again, like this 3 to 4 days per week, like where is that protocol? Where is that methodology coming from that it's proven? And then, of course, like my anecdotal stories is that like I've coached a lot of guys. Like I do enlargement coaching and injury coaching. Patreon.com/DocHink if you need to reach me. Actually, I mean, I can look at my Patreon data. I've coached at this point about 1,600 people. Okay, something like that in some form of fashion. And most of the guys that come to me and say that they aren't growing, aren't doing it at least 5 days a week. Okay, at least 5 days a week. Now, this is not proof. This is more anecdotes, but it's multiple anecdotes. And the other guys that aren't growing from pumping tend to not be using enough pressure, okay? And that might be because they get petechia, the little red dots. If you haven't seen my video on that, check it out. Or that just feels too intense or whatever it may be, but they're pumping to too low a pressure, therefore they aren't getting results. And, you know, we figure out a way to actually like gradually progress to a higher pressure. And I'm not trying to just perseverate and be a prick. So my guy, Joe Ego, like I'm really not trying to come at your neck, and I hope it's not coming off that way, because I do want to encourage more debates and more discussions like this. So next he says, daily or high volume sessions don't speed up results. They just get the tissue inflamed and eventually stiffen it. Staying in a moderate zone, steady pressure, consistent time, full recovery is what turns temporary expansion into permanent healthy growth. So my problem with this is that you say daily or high vacuum sessions don't speed up results. They keep the tissue inflamed and eventually stiffen it. If the tissue is really getting inflamed, why is it that most penile rehabilitation protocols recommend everyday use? Here's a quote here from a clinical recommendation. Clinical trials demonstrating efficacy of the vacuum erection device for erectile dysfunction involve daily use, which can be done in one 10-minute session or two 5-minute sessions throughout the day. Here's another article, Adherence to Barriers to Penile Rehabilitation. Once again, talking about daily use of the vacuum erection device. And here's one of my favorite papers here, and it actually broke down the evidence of use of the vacuum erection device. And as you guys can see in this chart, most of it says daily use, daily use, daily use. And so it's kind of, I just don't think it's a good look that you're saying daily use is not safe and will stiffen your penis, when all of these articles are literally saying you should use a vacuum erection device for rehabilitation purposes daily, if not twice a day. And the OP did respond to me, which is fine, but he responded to some other people in the chart in the chat, and he says, could you link these studies? And so he says, here's a study that explains how moderate, consistent vacuum use supports blood flow and prevents fibrosis, and why overdoing it or skipping rest days can have the opposite effect. I read the paper again. I've read it before, but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. It absolutely doesn't talk about overdoing it, and it doesn't talk about skipping rest days. I've made errors before. I want to know if I'm wrong. So please call me out and send me the segment of the paper that actually shows where it discusses that. But what it does talk about, guys, is actually daily use. And in fact, I guess you could argue and say that skipping rest days is a good thing because, for example, here's an excerpt here. Rania et al. Found that 17 versus 11% of recovery of erectile function with daily use of VED compared to non-VED use. So once again, daily use is better. Here's another excerpt here, all the way at the bottom. Daily use of the VED was begun at the day after catheter removal and continued for 90 days, okay? And this is talking about all of the benefits when it comes to, like in this study, where it shows improved index of erectile function and even decreased penile shrinking and increased penile length with daily VED use. Here's an excerpt here, guys. And in this excerpt, it talks about all of the different mechanisms, including decreased HIF-1 and TGF-beta and these markers of fibrosis, while increasing things like intracavernosal pressure, the E-nitric oxide. And what it says, guys, is once again, 5 minutes twice daily. Now, guys, this is from the actual paper that he used as a reference to in that response showing these things. And it's just like, I'm either illiterate, which is highly probable to be quite honest, but I just don't understand how he is trying to say that this paper is actually proving the literal opposite of what he's trying to argue. I mean, and here just for good measure, this study also proved the direct basic scientific evidence that VED therapy increased arterial blood flow. And once again, another excerpt here talking about how use of VEDs actually improves the oxygenation of the corporal tissue. And once again, these are in studies that usually have daily use, if not twice a day use. So guys, you can see I go deep into the literature. Of course, I have a course where I take you through step by step. In my personal belief, based on real scientific data like I'm discussing today, like what is the safest and most effective way to undergo enlargement. So if you're interested in hearing more, want a step-by-step thing, you can either just subscribe to my channel, watch all my videos, or if for time's sake, you can actually just get my course. So guys, where do I agree? Okay, because overall, I thought this was a great write-up, and I hope I'm not being too negative on this guy. I agree that more is not always more. I do agree that more frequent sessions can potentially lead to increased collagen deposition, tightening of the extracellular matrix, and overall lead to decreased long-term gains. And as I've said before, even in recent videos, I don't think you need to go all the way up to 12 inches of mercury, even though that rat study shows that 11.8 inches of mercury is the ideal pressure. I think you can still make gains even at 8 inches of mercury. Now, where I disagree is that you don't need a higher pressure to make gains. I think the evidence is very clear that higher pressure does lead to increased gains when it comes to pumping. The other thing is, I just made a video about the collagen response, but this paper here actually demonstrates that the actual strength of stimulus in this one paper did not actually contribute to the amount of collagen secretion. So whether you use a really strong stimulus or a weak stimulus, it still provided the same amount of collagen stimulation. This one paper, guys, there's once a day and even twice a day evidence of not only safety and efficacy when it comes to both enlargement and even penile rehabilitation. So I've said it before, I have a whole video on like why you don't need rest days, but like I disagree with that point. But guys, once again, I really applaud my guy for making this post. It says a new user with like low karma. This is a very advanced post. I have a feeling like this is one of the more experienced vets in the community that wanted to undergo like an alter ego to make this post in my channel. But even if it wasn't, man, hats off to you. Great post. I hope I didn't come off too critical because I really like what you had to say. I'm going to be more active on my subreddit, guys, if you want to reach me there, r/Hink. And guys, most importantly, I don't claim to be a guru with this. I do my research. I make my recommendations based on what I am seeing. If you disagree with me, I welcome that and I welcome discussion. But let me know what you think. What do you think is the ideal pressure range? What was your experience? Were you able to grow at lower pressure rates doing rest days in between? I want to know, guys. Like, seriously, I want to know. I'm going to be reading all these comments. Now, guys, if you actually want to do PE safely, consider my safety stack. It helps protect the tunica, protect the blood flow, and also protect the nerves and supports those processes. And remember, guys, there's nothing wrong with self-improvement, but you are enough just as you are. All right, guys. Peace and love.
Dr. Hink got the plug on the health, yeah. Got you thinking about your wealth, yeah. In his office, no stealth, yeah. Pinnacle of that below the belt, yeah. Checks and balance, he's managing. Working miracles, no damage. Got you covered, no panicking. Steady calm. In the clinic, no vanishing. Yeah, with Doc Hink, it's the way back.